Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think at a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. It's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. And what indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Altered Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a subject that will probably get us demonetized for a little bit, but whatever. It's only because we have a few trigger words in here that automatically get banned. So anyway, today's topic is slavery and the Bible. We're going to talk about whether or not it's a moral dilemma. Spoiler alert, it's not, but you have to stick to the end to figure out why. And it's a fairly simple answer. But it's just one of those things where, you can ask the person who wrote the poetry or a piece of art what the interpretation of a thing should be, or you can ask your English teacher. You're going to get two very different answers, and oftentimes the best answer is the one who did the authorship. And today we're going to ask Judaism as a whole how to interpret their own writings. And so to help me do this, I'm going to bring on my compatriot, Brad. And so hello, sir. How are you this fine evening?
Doing well. It's been a good weekend so far, so I'm really excited about the topic tonight. We've tackled this a few times on a few other podcasts in discussions with non-theists, or is what they're called. There's like this distinction between atheists and a non-theist, but
it's we have had this conversation with many, even Christians, actually.
Yes.
So, it's one of those where we feel like we've talked about it enough and so much that we forgot we haven't done an episode on this.
Right.
So now we're just going to do an episode, and plus we get to actually concentrate our thoughts here. When you're in the middle of a debate or a conversation with somebody who's actively against you, it's actually hard to get your point across oftentimes. But
Valid.
So in order to help us get our points across, I think another thing we have to do before we move forward is, who's with you in spirits tonight?
Tonight I am drinking a little more of my courage and conviction. I realized that I had actually accumulated more bottles of bourbon than I really can't buy anything new because I have to finish what I've got before Passover at this point. So
Yep.
So I've come up to that problem, and so I'm probably going to be drinking the same 3 things for the next, however long. But I'm also taking a page out of your book because I always do a Boilermaker. And I am trying this Coors Banquet. And yeah. Hey. How about you, sir?
I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, at least, I had a old fashioned. I made that old fashioned with this Basil Hayden dark rye.
Ooh.
Today, I'm going to have just the dark rye.
Nice.
With my Coors Banquet, of course. And rye is just one of those different. It's good.
It is. It is. I love it, though. Something about the bitterness of rye just makes the bourbon that much better for me.
I just like the Basil Hayden again. I'll always point it out. Somebody showed me the BH on the metal Basil Hayden wrap here, and it was at the synagogue, and they were like, "Hey, Baruch Hashem."
That's awesome.
Yes.
Oh, so I guess to get the discussion started, right? One of the one of the big issues, and one of the reasons this is very frequently talked about in apologetic circles, is the moral dilemma it seems to bring up, right? And I say seems to bring up. What I'm going to say is going to be a very extreme position to some, but it is what I find to be a logically consistent position. And I think if anything, your argument has to be logically consistent and internally consistent. It can't have any dissonance in it, at least for me. I don't respect people who make arguments that are not internally and logically consistent. We have a problem in modern society where there are certain words that are inherently taboo, and they're inherently taboo because we only view those words through one singular lens. And there are multiple words like this. Honestly, lust is one of those words, right? In Western Christianity, we tend to view the word lust only through a negative lens. And so the idea of a husband lusting for his wife sounds negative, even though that's actually biblically correct. And that's a positive thing. That's how it should be.
Right.
Slavery is another one of those words. We tend to view the word slavery, especially in the Western world, through the lens of slavery as it took place in the West, post 1600s, right?
Antebellum South.
Right, right, the antebellum South. And so anytime that we read the word slavery or slave or any condonance of slavery in the Bible, we superimpose that idea onto it. And then we blanket the entire idea and the entire topic of slavery as being immoral. It's just outrightly immoral on its face. And that's because we're viewing it through that lens. I think that that's an inappropriate way to look at it. I think, as with anything, there are multiple layers to a topic. Slavery in every culture has not always been chattel slavery like we saw in the antebellum South. And there are even some arguments that would suggest that what we typically get idealized about the antebellum South are really only a few extreme cases, and that, broadly speaking, it really wasn't that. And I think that when it comes to biblical slavery, we really do need to, as you said, consult the people of the book, the people of the text, because biblical slavery, and I'm just going to come out and say it, is not immoral.
No, if anything, in fact, the biblical model of slavery is probably one of the most progressive things to exist in the ancient world when it comes to financial issues at all. In fact, with the issue of slavery, it is it's done in such a way that's basically unheard of, especially for its time. But even all the way until maybe 200 years ago, it would be the single most progressive version of it. Again, something we have to, I guess, clarify. There's two things that's happening here. One, we have to remember that the abolitionist movement was founded based on biblical Judeo-Christian values.
Right.
And so the whole idea of the abolition of slavery in the American South, as it was happening in the American South, is a biblical one. And then two, as a historian, I always have to bring this up, but we have this tendency to modernize ancient concepts through a modern lens, right? It's called modernizing. When you're interpreting something that's ancient through a much more modern lens. We all do this. It's usually inadvertent, unless you are trained to read historical documents through a particular lens. You're going to do this whether you like it or not. It's not necessarily deliberate. But yeah, so like you were just saying, we think in the American mindset anyway, can't say if this is true all over the world, but especially in America, you think the word slavery, whether you read it in the Bible or anywhere else, your first and immediate thought is the chattel slavery of the antebellum South and the way that was handled. And you just imagine that that's just how it was done since the beginning of time. And so that the slavery being talked about in the Bible is no different. And that's simply not the case. So we have to we have to actively train ourselves not to modernize the text and read it as it was intended to be read, in its time period with the information that was available to them as well at the time. Plus our own moral standards have changed over time. That's a big thing we need to consider is, once again, the Torah, when it was released into the world, was the most morally progressive document to have ever come out in its time. And today it's basically the standard for basic morality. But it was still not, it wasn't written in a vacuum. It was still written with a reality that it was dealing with. And so we need to be aware of those kinds of things.
And to another point, because I understand there are some apologists out there who would argue that, the ultimate plan of God was to abolish slavery, right? And so we've achieved that in the West, right? We would view that as a victory that God has won in the West, right? That's how those apologists would probably view the situation, because their argument would be that God was relaying the Torah, essentially, because that's really the document, that's the part of Scripture that we're talking about, right? He was relaying the Torah to a people who existed in a culture where slavery already existed, right? And so working within the morality of the time frame that he was speaking to, he didn't make them quit cold turkey, but gave them a better version of it to live by, right? With the hopes that they would take that and progress further into the future to abolish slavery. That's the argument. I don't think that's a very consistent argument, because I don't believe the idea that the Torah is only a model of better ethics to live by. I think that the Torah is much more specific and particular, and that it intends for the principles that it teaches to be lived by. I don't think that the Torah was given to be a slightly better version of culture than what existed at the time. I think that the Torah is God's morality. That is my position, is that the Torah is God's morality. Case closed, absolutely shut. So when we take that idea and we understand the decay and how morality has changed throughout time, for me especially, because this is a very popular topic with atheists, obviously. We were talking about this a little bit backstage. Again, to maintain the logical consistency, we don't balk at the idea of somebody who ate at a restaurant and couldn't pay for their meal, washing dishes. Though effectively, that is what biblical slavery is.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to simplify it in such a way, I will allow that, because it's pretty apropos, more or less, to kind of what's happening, biblically speaking. So, once again, as a historian, though, I just kind of want to point out, and you pointed this out, but I actually want to build upon it by actually moving on to our next point here, what slavery is and what slavery is not. And we will circle back to whether it is a moral dilemma. But something that you brought up was when the Torah was given, right? Slavery was a reality. And this is a common argument amongst Christians that it's meant to be a progressive document with the hopes of eventually abolishing it. Whether you agree with that premise or not, the initial portion of that premise, the Torah was given with the reality of slavery as it was. That part is absolutely true. And it was it's one of those things where there was no culture in the world, period, that does not have some sort of form of slavery. And this is true even today. And in fact, if you're a citizen of the United States, you are in a certain way, according to a biblical premise anyway, a slave to the country in some fashion.
Yes.
We changed the word and make it a little prettier so that it's a little bit easier for us to stomach, and we don't recoil at as much. But the taxes are the same thing, essentially.
Well, every man who has signed his selective service document,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's slavery.
You are agreeing to a certain extent to be a slave. And if you've been in the military, you've signed a contract for a certain amount of time in which to be a servant of the country against your will, to follow orders, whether you like it or not. There are many forms of what we call, service or even indentured servitude that technically fit the biblical definition of slavery. And this is kind of the reality of what's going on the ground. In the ancient days, there's what they call slavery is what we call these other different forms of servitude that are indentured in a way with a contract or a kind of maybe a selective permanence, depending on how much debt you might be in or how much debt you're willing to put yourself in. Stuff like that.
Slavery with extra steps.
Yeah. But it's definitely slavery. What it is not is always chattel antebellum South slavery. What it is usually because you got yourself into some sort of situation in which you have to pay off in a way, in one way or another, in some form, a kind of debt or indenturement. It doesn't always have to be debt. Sometimes you didn't have any debt to begin with, but you're not exactly in a great place. And so, we take out loans today. One way to do that is to put yourself into servitude, sell yourself into slavery in a way, so that you can come back from that in a better position. It's a little bit like taking out a loan for 7 years, especially the biblical version, because 7 years is actually the limit for most slaves, particularly Hebrew slaves. We're actually going to get into certain. That's such a weird law to me because I have it here as a banner, but there's actually like, how do you have a non-Hebrew, non-convert slave for that long, more than 7 years? Because there's certain things that you could never do if you didn't convert your slave. We'll get into that.
Right.
The Talmud has a whole thing about it.
One other thing that I think is worth pointing out with regard to this, again, there are those who would view the West as having won this victory, right? We abolished slavery, and so that's a victory that's in the right direction. I think that's a very one-dimensional way of looking at it. It's certainly a moral good thing that the form of slavery that existed was abolished. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, there's no argument there. But again, that's not all that slavery was or that it encompasses. And in today, we all are in some way, form, or fashion could be considered slaves. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of that's really what I'm getting at is biblical slavery helped alleviate a certain level of class division that we still have today with no recourse for alleviating it because slavery has been abolished in the West, right? The only way that we really have of maybe doing the same thing, I'll say it lies entirely in the hands of most women who seek to be hypergamous, right? Which is that's to marry above your station. Mm-hmm. The laws concerning biblical slavery didn't make that as taboo as it probably is considered among the upper class in the West. Matter of fact, it was considered somewhat normal, and that's what it helped to pursue, right? Was the alleviation of class difference, the alleviation of financial difference between the upper class and the lower class, because it was entirely possible that a wealthy man might purchase a woman for his son to marry, who was obviously, if she was purchased, then she comes from a much lower class family. Right. But their marital union would bring together this upper class and lower class family, and both families would therefore benefit from it.
Right. Marriage, particularly back then, was more of an economic choice anyway. That's why we talk a lot about prearranged marriages and stuff. Many times, two fathers of families who, are like, say, friends, really good friends in some way, but from very different financial backgrounds, agree to join houses. Again, marriage, very few people married for romance back then. It just, that is a brand new thing in history. We cannot think of a world without it. But up until, again, like 200 years ago, marrying for romance was all but unheard of. It was very rare and was basically reserved for the elites who had the ability to choose for romantic reasons who they could marry. But many people would prearrange these marriages in order to help bring their whole family up another class by joining houses with somebody who was well established. That's why, again, you see these like fairly young girls usually get prearranged marriages at like the age of 16 to a 30-year-old man. Historically, sounds gross to us today, but the reason that was done is, one, she's a young girl. She has no job, nowhere to go. She's almost of the age to get out of the house if she isn't already. She needs someone to take care of her, because women are mostly homemakers, especially in ancient history. And a man at the age of his same age, at 16, has no trade, has no established wealth, has nothing really to offer for a marriage, because they're both starting from ground zero. But a 30-year-old man who's mastered his trade, has established himself in the community for a particular way. He's the milk farmer or the butter maker, whatever, the bread guy, the newspaper print guy, whatever his role is. He's established himself in a career and is likely stable enough to support a wife who has nothing to offer financially or anything. It's just to help make the home. And then you join those two houses together. And now that entire family, again, when people married back then, it was not between two people. It was between two whole families. Houses were joining together in ancient days for marriage. So now her whole family is being brought under the household of this very rich, very well-established 30-year-old man who comes from good money. And he is supporting the entire family now. So now the whole family is brought up. And it actually levels things out, obviously, because he's got to support more financially. So it kind of brings him down, technically speaking. So everything starts to even and level themselves out. And that's very much a financial decision. Ancient marriage is a financial decision. And it's actually very much akin to ancient slavery. Ancient marriage and ancient slavery share a lot of similarities. And that's primarily the reason. That's why you even, quote unquote, purchase a bride. Now, the dowry is not a purchasing of the bride, technically speaking. Actually, it's her insurance. If she is divorced from that man for whatever reason, she is guaranteed that money. And it's a large sum of money usually. That way, if she needs to go on her own, she can actually support herself for a very long time as a result of being shamed by a divorce for whatever that reason that might be. So a dowry is not really you purchasing a bride. It's actually more you putting aside an insurance so that should you decide to be garbage and want to divorce your wife, you owe her money to support herself. And that's actually how that's supposed to be set up. And that's usually you'd hand that money over to the father. You can't hold on to it. That's conflict of interest, obviously. So the father holds on to that money and it gets willed to her. Yeah, there's a whole thing, but you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities. There's a contract involved. There's a bringing up from a poorer state, giving yourself over in a sort of sense of servitude. Now, slavery obviously is a much more extreme version of that. It's not marriage 1-to-1, but the similarities are shared because they are both viewed as a financial transaction for the betterment of one's position in the society.
Right. Well, yeah. It's interesting because the prospect of a wife, from what we can gather from the Bible, and I do stress specifically from the Bible, because again, the nuance that gets brought to bear in rabbinic writings is actually what elevates the position. Biblically speaking, a wife is more or less the highest form of a slave that a man can purchase. If we really just reduce it down to bare bones, it's just the highest status of a slave that that there is. And again, it sounds really taboo to say it that way, but that's why I stress the importance of the nuances that are brought to bear, and not just nuances, but the minutia and particulars that are brought to bear in rabbinic literature, expounding on the dynamic of that relationship, because that's really where wives get elevated.
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up, because even then with the slave thing, and we're about to get into rabbinic literature here in a second, when you quote unquote purchase a wife, you purchase an equal, right? Now, Talmudically speaking, when you buy yourself a slave, you buy yourself a master.
I've got that citation ready.
Which is actually the point that, go ahead, what's the citation?
Kiddushin 20a, between 15 and 16. Says the Baraita continues, this means that there shall not be a situation in which you eat fine bread and he eats inferior bread, bread from coarse flour mixed with bran, which is low quality, animal feed basically. There shall not be a situation where you drink aged wine and he drinks inferior wine. There shall not be a situation in which you sleep comfortably on bedding made from soft sheets and he sleeps on straw. From here the sages stated, anyone who acquires a Hebrew slave is considered like one who acquires for himself a master.
Yeah. Now, that is actually more or less the standard of slavery from the Hebrew biblical perspective. That's how they understood slavery was meant to be. Now, of course, as you read in the citation, and people are going to be quick to bring it up, well, that's right. Only for Hebrew slaves. This is where I want to talk about a strange muddying of the waters when it comes to this slavery stuff in the Bible, because there are tons of laws in the Talmud, particularly from Tractate Gittin or Kiddushin. Actually, I have a few of them up here on my bookshelf. But and I went over these when we were doing the Daf Yomi a couple of years ago. But you got to remember, if you are a Hebrew, you purchase a slave at any capacity, you can't have any slave for longer than 10 years. Non-Israelite slaves, at the Jubilee, you have to let them go at the very least. There's only one way out of that to have a slave for forever, literally, is this ritual with an awl on the door.
Ooh, I'm glad you brought that up. Because even that, that
demonstrates
how that situation still warrants liberty at the Jubilee.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. So, but and again, point being, in that biblical passage alone, it talks about the slave saying, "But I love my master," and not wanting to leave, because that should be the standard of excellence. The idea is you are not supposed to be a harsh master. You're supposed to emulate God in the same ways. And if you are a servant of God, if you are a slave of God, and God treats you so well, then likewise, anyone who is underneath you at any employment capacity, because again, some of these slaves are employees, for lack of a better term, you have to treat them in the same way, with the same level of respect that is due to them. But the reason I want to bring this muddy into the waters part up is because there's this, you got to remember, say you are rich enough to actually purchase yourself a slave, a non-Hebrew slave. If you want to eat the Passover or partake in, particularly the Passover, your entire household needs to be circumcised. Now, that is a partial conversion in Jewish law. If they are a slave and you put them through a ritual proselyte conversion process, they are considered like half Jewish until the end of their contract. And as soon as they're released, they become a full-blown Jew, right? As soon as they're released from their slavery. So there's this weird, like, even if you're allowed to keep them for longer than 7 years, as soon as you circumcise them, you have to treat them like a Hebrew slave and then release them at the 7-year period. And then they achieve full Jewish status. And it's also true in Jewish law that even if you purchase a Hebrew slave, he has this half Jewish status as a result of being the property and ownership of another Jew. And so even full-blown Hebrew slaves actually share the same sort of status as the partial convert slave. So what you actually end up doing is you take non-Jews and you are creating more Israelites, actually. Funny enough, you're getting them into the family of God, and in a lot of ways, that's a really good thing, because now they have a support structure of the entire Israelite tribes, the families. They belong to a land, a set of values and people, as a result of a few, up to about 7 years, give or take, of indentured servitude. And I think I'm going to switch to using indentured servitude because that's really what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the better points to make, right? Because that's really always where the discussion kind of derails, especially for those who are in apologetics trying to defend the Bible. It always derails at the point where people make this hard distinction between a Hebrew slave and a non-Hebrew slave. And especially in particular, the verse in Exodus 21, I think it's like 20 through 22 or something like that, where it mentions what is to be done, right? If a slave dies from being beaten, but then if he doesn't die from being beaten, everybody, especially a lot of atheists, treat this like, oh, so the Bible condones you beating somebody within an inch of their life. It's like, well, no. Again, if you read the rabbinic literature on this, it is not you can beat them within an inch of their life. If you were to do so, you would actually still be culpable in a crime, right? There would still be levels of restitution that you have to pay because you have beaten a human being within an inch of their life. Mm-hmm. The idea that the man does not die from his beatings is such that the beating is meant to be disciplinary, right? Not abusive. And there is a clear point at which it becomes abusive. And that's the point at which you now, as the master, have committed a crime. Disciplinary action is, as the Bible says, something that is within the authority of any owner of property. And I think that's something worth addressing too, right? We view the word property in the West as being something that's inanimate, and so viewing something that is living as property, somehow we have this idea that it reduces the value of that thing, or reduces its overall worth in the eyes of God, even to refer to it as property. Look, if you are a parent, then you own your children, right? The idea that as a human being, it is immoral to be owned by another human being is just a non-starter, right? Children all belong to someone. What does that mean? That means that someone has ownership of them.
And ownership can not only mean like actual ownership, but also responsibility for, which is the biggest point actually that I think you're trying to make.
Yes. And again, and as far as discipline, had a great discussion with Dr. John Roseman on this, is that there's any form of discipline can be used abusively, but that doesn't make any and all forms of discipline abuse. There is a fine line between them all. And it seems that even the Bible recognizes that. One thing I think is worth pointing out when discussing this is that when you dive into the Talmudic literature on this, you won't just read it once, you'll actually read it numerous times, that this is a topic in which any of the verses about this topic are to be interpreted with leniency, not with rigidity. Right? This is one of those topics where rabbinically across the board they agree. We take the lenient interpretation of this.
Put it another way, what the Bible says, that is the maximum sentence, not the minimum sentence. This is
right.
as far as you're allowed to go in as an example.
Right. So, it's like, yeah, where the Bible says that, that for the non-Israelite slave, right, for the Gentile slave, so to speak, that a man may keep them and pass them on to his children as an inheritance, right? Again, that's like worst case scenario. He may do this, but that's not the intention. And then his children would also have to treat them as well as he himself was required to treat them.
And then two things as well. Again, I said responsible for. The slave still is a human and he does things. Likely if you have a non-Hebrew slave, then what you have is a person who is not part of the culture. So you just like your son, now biblically speaking, if you have a child, any crimes that your child commits, you committed and you are punished for. Not the child. He's a minor. You can't punish a child as a minor in the Sanhedrin in the court system. The same is true for the slaves. You are responsible for what your slaves do. So that is like a key point when remembering this whole discipline thing, is the slave is not being punished by the legal system for his actions. You are. So it is up to you to discipline the slave so that you retain your legality, right, in your situation within the community. And one of the ways in which you're allowed to do that is, in a pretty physical manner. And again, we're talking about a person who's likely not assimilated into the culture in any way. This could be a wartime slave, a pagan, a really rebellious person who's could be a very violent person. If that's the case, this is actually very much an act of mercy, because you're not allowed to simply kill him because you don't like him anymore. You are responsible for bringing him up properly so that he could eventually be let go into the society at large as a citizen. And when you let him go, you have to give him everything that he is due. And especially if you made him a partial convert so that you could have your Passover meal. Again, there's so much going on with this. The discipline thing is just a way for that retention. And that's an important thing. It is not a requirement. You don't have to beat your slaves within an inch of their life. That's not what's happening. If anything, as you say, the Talmud clarifies, you're not only not allowed to do that, but if he dies within 3 days, then you're still responsible for that man's death. And so that
decapitation is the punishment for that, actually.
Yeah. So there's we're not talking about the same thing at all when we talk about biblical slavery and like human ownership. We're actually talking very much about different methods biblically for assimilating, raising from poverty, war. When the Israelites would go to war, they would acquire for themselves POWs, and these POWs, well, you kind of have two options. You can let them go. They could come back and try to kill you later, or you can indentured servitude them. They owe you now, and you eventually, raise them into being able to live within the society. That's probably going to take longer than 7 years, because again, he fought to kill you, so there is that. But yeah, these are all things you have to consider, and you are directly responsible for everything that goes on with said person. And as the Talmud already even said, you have to treat them as an equal in many, many respects.
I want to address two things real quick.
Go ahead.
This, yes, and this is a little bit off topic. We'll have to do a video on this at some point, maybe like a follow-up to my interview with John Roseman, which if you haven't seen, go watch it. It was an excellent interview. Extraordinarily wise man, got his book that we recommended. he actually he gave me a personally signed copy recently when I became a father. But this, yes, there are many Christians who grew up probably specifically in an independent fundamental background, who remember hearing, maybe not from your own parents, but from somebody's parents, right? That you had it so easy because, back then, just for, being a little bit disrespectful, it could have costed you your life. No. That's because, first of all, the Bible decides and determines what disrespect to a parent is, not you. That's one of my favorite things to point out to parents who like to use this, is like, you don't get to decide what disrespect is. The Bible does. And there are so many other stipulations surrounding this, kind of like the slavery subject we're addressing, no, it's not just for disrespectful children. It is for literally the worst kind of human being. And it was actually a punishment to the parents to have to be the first ones to cast the stones, because it meant that you failed as a parent.
There's so many other... not only that, but only the parents could bring this forth. You have to bring it to a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin has to rule the death penalty, right? So the whole situation itself is like, we're talking worst case scenario. Yeah, you're the parent and you just don't know what else to do. And you're contemplating bringing your child before the Sanhedrin and bringing forward the death penalty as a
it's also not a child.
Yeah, and no one else can do it for you. You have to be the one. The parent is the only one who can do it. So actually that law is very progressive in that it puts the power back into the parents' hands for really rebellious kids. If they're underage, if they're minors and not adults according to the law, then the parent actually has almost all of the power here when it comes to that. It's incredibly progressive for the time. Otherwise, many other societies would just cut their hands off.
Right. But the other thing is, since we've addressed the subject of being a servant to somebody who is extraordinarily wealthy and how they had to provide for you the same things that they would provide for themselves. I mean, again, addressing the class separation that I mentioned before. I mean, really, how many of us would say no to being a slave to Elon Musk?
You know what?
The lifestyle, like, how many of our lives would actually upgrade by being a slave for Elon Musk?
Let's even change the word to put it back in perspective. How many of you would turn down being an intern for Elon Musk?
Right.
Because make no mistake, being an intern, an unpaid intern, slavery. And it's modern and legal slavery. I don't care who you think you are, but that's precisely what doing work without pay, with the expectation of basically exposure and a chance to possibly be offered that job later, like an apprenticeship. That's slavery. And that was often what would happen too with many of these ancient people. If they find themselves hard on their luck and they need to sell themselves, as a slave to another person, because they just fell into crippling debt, oftentimes they would sell themselves to somebody, again, who is well established, who can afford to do it. That person would bring them back into a position where they could recover from the reason that they sold themselves to begin with. And the Bible even makes concessions. They're within a certain time frame. They have to buy their land. They're allowed to have to buy their land back if they sold their land, because they were impoverished. The Bible is incredibly progressive and very forgiving about bringing people back to where they came from, should they have ever had to put themselves in that position in the first place. But again, when you buy yourself a slave, you're not just going to be like, well, make me dinner. Oftentimes it would be, well, I'm a blacksmith and I need help around the shop. So I'm going to teach you blacksmithing, and you are going to be my blacksmith for the next 7 years. And after 7 years, you'll be a master blacksmith. I'm going to give you your tools. I'm going to give you enough money to start your own blacksmithing business. You will have your freedom and you have a trade.
Here's the other thing, is that a slave, even a non-Israelite slave, was allowed the opportunity to redeem themselves. What does this mean, right? How does that work? Well, because biblical slavery doesn't really go without pay.
Yes.
That's the other thing. It doesn't go without pay, which is, so that's an important thing, right? Because remember what I said about the wife thing, right? Well, a man owes a wife a certain amount of money. A certain portion of his finances that he makes belongs to his wife, who is a glorified slave, more or less. So that, like your slaves also are entitled to a certain amount of financial compensation. All right. This was the means by which they could actually redeem themselves. And the interesting thing here, because what that brings into light a whole other discussion, right? Well, how do they redeem themselves, right? Because they have to be appraised, and a certain value has to be established. And the appraisal is actually for the sake of the slave, not for the master. Okay. Right. In the scenario that you've laid out, right, where a blacksmith acquires a servant who he will now teach to be a blacksmith, and that blacksmith learns very well, right, and they become a master blacksmith. Well, now their value has actually increased, right? But when they redeem themselves, they're not redeeming themselves according to their current value. They are redeeming themselves according to the value that they were purchased at that point. But let's say the opposite is true, okay? Maybe you acquired a servant who was at a certain point of utility, when at an age of utility, but over the years, age has kind of caught up with them, and so now actually their market value would actually be less than it was when you acquired them. They can still redeem themselves, and they would redeem themselves according to their current market value, not what you purchased them at. All right, the slave redeems themselves according to whatever price is most beneficial to them to redeem themselves at.
Yeah, it's for their own redemption. And again, biblically speaking, a man is worth his wages. So even a slave needs to be paid a daily wage. Essentially, the slavery aspect is the contract aspect. It's more or less the you will work for me, whether you like to or not, and you're agreeing by signing below that you're going to work for this wage every day for me for X number of years. And it doesn't have to be 7. It can be less than 7, of course, depending on the person selling himself. And again, oftentimes people were selling themselves. It was a way to get out of a level of poverty. And of course, an arranged marriage is a different thing entirely, but it's viewed in the same contractual obligation sense. Often, people who are arranging these marriages are doing so for economic reasons, which is super common. We've already talked mostly about that, but
ooh, there's a good question.
Yes. So, will you speak to essentially the Apostle Paul's allusions to slavery and discipleship? Again, slavery in biblical times is just a reality. Even again, Paul is like, were you called a slave? Continue being a slave. But slavery is also just the word for servant, eved in Hebrew, particularly. The word for idolatry, avodah zara, it means in service of idols. Avodah coming from the root word eved, or slave, or service, or servant, depending on how you conjugate it. And so any form of service makes you a servant, and in Hebrew, that's the same word for slave. And so sometimes Bible translations won't even render it as slave. They'll render it as servant, because often that's more or less what is meaning to be conveyed, rather than, just the literal word for word translation. But to speak on Rav Shaul's allusions, I mean, his point is to point out that you are not of yourselves. You were bought at a price, right? Redeemed. And so you're a slave to one master or another. There are two masters, and you choose your master. You can either be a slave to sin and death, or you can be a slave to God. But you will always be a slave to somebody, either. And that's the kind of the key takeaway.
And I think I think in terms of discipleship, right? Because that's the idea of being a student of a rabbi, right? Is something that's going to be directly relevant to this point. Is that if we consider what the idea of service to Hashem is, right? And what that would mean ultimately for religious leadership, that kind of makes you the overseer, right? So you yourself are still a slave, but you're the slave who knows the rules the best, right? So what discipleship is at that point is you interning under the overseer, so to speak, right? So that you can also learn to know the rules the best, so that you can also then move on in life to be, the chief servant of the house, so to speak.
Yeah. So I guess we should circle back now to moral dilemma. You brought up a point backstage, which I think is actually worth repeating, about libertarian free will.
Oh, yes. Right. So again, because this discussion is most relevant in apologetics when you are dealing with an atheist who is arguing the subject of morality, right? And now there are those who would say that's ironic in and of itself, the whole idea of having an objective morality without God. There are a lot of atheists who would even say that, well, morality is subjective, and you kind of sacrifice the ability to say to make any kind of moral statement if you agree that morality is subjective. But be that as it may, right? Most would also still agree, because their position is kind of incumbent on this, a type of libertarian free will. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of determinists out there, but they still believe in a sort of libertarian free will in as much as, like, they are the masters of their own lives, right? They should, by their own sense of morality, have the freedom to choose to do with their own bodies whatever they want, as long as it's not hurting somebody else, right? The non-aggression principle.
Right.
To that I say, and you can't tell me that it's immoral for a man to sell himself as property to another man. The answer that I've gotten typically is, well, it's immoral for the man who's purchasing, right? Because owning, the idea is like submitting yourself to be owned is not exactly immoral for you. It's immoral for the person who seeks to own you, right? They're the bad person. It's kind of like that whole classism, rich bad, poor good, mentality. And my problem with that is, like, okay, so then how do you justify OnlyFans, right? I'm not going to waste too much time explaining what OnlyFans is for those of you who may not know, but it is bad.
The main point being, you can't be okay with one and not okay with the other.
Right. You cannot hold a logically and internally consistent position by saying that it's immoral for somebody to submit themselves to be owned by another human being, right? With their own free will, to be purchased by another human being. And then in the next breath say, well, OnlyFans is okay, though.
Yeah, and that's that consistency with libertarian free will, that particular worldview, particular point of view. Yeah, so when it comes to the moral dilemma thing, I think we've actually been pretty good at illustrating that, one, there is no moral dilemma. What we understand as slavery in the American South is not at all what we're talking about here. But two, everyone is already a slave to somebody in some way, shape, or form. If you pay taxes, you are in some way a slave. Indentured servitude, paying off a debt, right? As you said, no one shrugs when we force somebody to wash dishes who didn't pay for their dinner. That's indentured servitude. It's paying off a debt through service of a kind. These are mainly what we're actually talking about here, and there is no moral dilemma with that.
Controversial statement.
Sorry?
I'm going to make a really controversial statement. But for men who are paying child support and not getting to spend time with their children, those men are slaves.
Ooh.
Simple fact. That's just an inherent reality.
I was a Marine for 8 years. I was a slave for 8 years. That's what that is. It's military service. These are what we're talking about here. And so there is no moral dilemma. The only moral dilemma is the antebellum South chattel style slavery. And again, the abolitionist movement was founded on the Judeo-Christian values of getting rid of that kind of treatment to other human beings. And so that you can try and create that the Bible allows for slavery and say this is a moral problem if you're a moral human being and you believe in a moral God. Those are not, that's a false dichotomy. We're not talking about the same things. We have modernized one word while retaining the ancient context. You can't do that. You have to retain the ancient context and retain the ancient definitions of the words and everything. You can't just modernize the one word.
You can't be anachronistic about biblical slavery.
Yeah. And again, most of what we do daily, many of us are actually still involved in a type of biblical slavery. If you have some sort of contract or work for somebody else in order to pay off debts, you belong not to yourself at that point. And you're falling within the purview of biblical slavery if you're working to pay off those debts.
Actually, yeah. I mean, in very simple terms, if you have debt,
at all,
then you are a slave.
You are a slave. You are not you work because you have to. If you are in no debt at all, you work likely because you kind of want to, and obviously there are things that you want, right? You're in your bills that you do have to pay. But if you have no debt at all, you can go live in the mountains and homestead and be a servant of no one but yourself. That's not an option for anyone who is in debt, in which case you are a slave.
Right. So, yeah, the subject of a moral dilemma is there's more nuance to it than that, which is fascinating to me, right? Because there are subjects in which there actually is no nuance. You know, it is pretty cut and dry, black and white. That people who argue the moral dilemma of slavery would argue that there is more nuance to, you know, which bathroom to use and stuff like that. You know, that's there are those who would argue that there's way more nuance to that, and there really is no nuance to that. But they would also argue there's no nuance to slavery when in fact there's a lot of nuance to this subject.
Yeah, in fact.
While you're getting that, one of my favorites, right? And I still haven't gotten a satisfactory answer to this. I was asked once, right? Because this was the question, and that's the thing of a lot of atheists. They really like their gotcha moment questions, right? That's their favorite part of discourse is a gotcha moment question. And because this gentleman had never received a satisfactory answer to that, he really thought this was a gotcha moment question. So the question was, can you think of any circumstance at all under which it is a moral thing for one person to purchase and own as property another person? And instantly I thought, well, are you really going to tell me that Oskar Schindler was an immoral man? Are we ready to say that he was an immoral man?
Oskar Schindler owned human beings.
Don't know who Oskar Schindler is, right? Go watch the movie Schindler's List. You need to go watch the movie Schindler's List.
He purchased for property human beings, and by doing so, saved hundreds
their lives.
Yeah, and all I wanted to bring out was these are the volumes dedicated to the topic that we're talking about.
That is how much nuance there is on the topic.
Yeah, there's no nuance for owning another human being. Well, actually, there are 5 volumes that are very particular about this topic in Talmudic literature. And it's not 5 volumes in how to purchase a slave. That's not how this works. These are 5 volumes in all sorts of different scenarios that change everything. Again, the partial convert is just one of them that's discussed in these books here. There are many other things, like the laws of Yevamot, the kinsman redeemer, and if that kinsman redeemer happens to be a slave, a servant of another person, what do we do? Do we release him? Can he still get chalitza performed so that he's not obligated? Or how does this work? And what do you do with partial converts who then become slaves? Or what is the status? There's a lot here, and it's because you have to treat them like a human being, but still with a contractual obligation under service. So these 5 volumes protect the slave legally. These 5 volumes ensure that the slaves get all of their human rights met, and it covers all their bases for the time of their slavery, whatever that time frame might be. That's how important it was to treat all humans with dignity in the Hebrew mindset of slavery here. And that's what's going on in the Bible. It's not at all just owning a human being and now I have a slave. Great, yay. That's not it at all. There's a whole lot more going on here. So that's the, if anything, that's the moral dilemma is a lot of your OSHA laws come from these 5 volumes.
Yeah, I think probably the thing that is missing most from this is that in the biblical context, people are not out there seeking to get slaves, right?
Yeah.
The idea is not for you to be looking for an occasion to have a slave. That is found nowhere in the basis of the biblical text or any of the rabbinic literature on it. It is all based on when the occasion happens, right? If somebody acquires a debt that they cannot pay, or if they are in dire straits and would financially benefit from being a slave to you, right? So in other words, really, biblically, slavery actually seems to be a tool for helping society.
Or they're a prisoner of war.
Right.
You become a slave if you're a POW. Yeah, so, yeah. It is one of the most moral things is the laws of slavery in the biblical texts. It's, again, probably the most progressive of any ancient civilization ever. And here are the 5 volumes to prove that. So we've reached the end of our show. We got a couple of announcements, of course. Don't forget to bless the like button and believe in the subscribe button. Ring the bell so you know when you get another episode coming out. We also will be doing the After Partes here, post-show, for those of you who support the show. You can support us. It says Patreon supporters. It's for all supporters. You can support us on the website at alternatemedia.com. That's ALTARNATE media.com. You can become a member there. Memberships start as low as $1. They come with a lot of exclusive content, as well as many other perks, which include hanging out with us post-show. You can do whatever you want. You can have a chat about the topic. We can sit in complete awkward silence, whatever you want to do. Yeah, Lion's Den. If you have a question for us, we hang out in there. You got us for an hour post-show. And that's why you want to ring the bell. If you are a supporter and you have a question for us, ring the bell, stick around till after the show, and ask us whatever it is you want to ask us. It can be anything. We're ready for it all.
I was going to say, a lot of awesome things coming up this year. Again, don't forget on the website also, there is merchandise. So if you want something that is branded with the Alternate Media brand and maybe a cool Bible verse on the back or something, there's a few things up there, coffee mugs and whatnot. And working on a few new big projects, a couple of old big projects that we started a little while back and are now putting more effort into. So be looking for some really cool stuff coming up in the future. Yeah,
I'm excited for what we have coming up. One of them's a book, and actually we have like 3 books, but still.
there's a few books in the works right now.
Yeah, but 2 of them are like this close to being done. I'm super excited about it. All right, so I think that brings us to a close. I guess that'll about do it for announcements. So once again, we'll see you guys in the after parties if you want to stick around. And if you want to support the ministry and become a member, you can do so on our website or the Patreon. We prefer if you go to the website.
Yeah.
And even if you don't want to be a member, but you still want to donate and give to the ministry, any and all memberships and donations. We are a 501c3 organization, so they are tax deductible. And so if you want to make any donations, feel free to go to our website and support us. And so that being said, we also want a huge thanks and shout out to all of our supporters who currently support us and have been supporting us for so long. You keep the not just the lights on, but everything up and running here. And we're very, very thankful for all of your generous donations. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've got, I guess Purim is going to be the next, bigger holiday coming up, where we have our big giveaway, give away a bunch of books and a grand prize. And you guys all pitch in for that. And so our Purim Fest is kind of how we give it all back. And it's always a blast, always a good time. We'll have to think up something special for this year. So
I got a couple of ideas, so stick around for the big Purim giveaway. We give away like usually about $1,000 worth of books. So you definitely want to get in on that. And if you want to be considered for that, you got to be a member. So,
Absolutely.
I think we should go ahead and head on over to the after part, Ez. So I'm ready to close out if you're ready to close out.
Absolutely. We hope that this has educated, enlightened, and maybe even touched you in a way. And definitely hope to see you guys all back next time. That being said, l'chaim.
L'chaim.